You have written memoirs, you tell your story, you understand the importance of other people telling you their stories.
Sure.
Why do we need to know each other's stories? I mean, where does that come from? And why do it? Why tell them?
I think you can't give yourself away. The only way you have to give yourself to someone else is through story. You can list facts forever, but even the facts to some extent aren't independent of you. But the story is how you occupy your life in such a way that with the story you're kind of reenacting it, letting somebody else see what it was like. And I think more fundamentally than that, I think there's something before that. I don't think we know who we are until we begin to story ourselves. There's a considerable theory in psychology and in cognitive science saying that the only thing that separates human beings from other species now, other mammals particularly, is not the ability to think, but is the autobiographical self. That is the self that can reflect upon itself and can cough up some product from the reflection. And so in many ways, just being human means that we have a huge need, if we're going to be full human beings, to tell story, to tell it to ourselves, to tell it to other people. But it's the only way you can give yourself to anybody else.
Why don't we readily do that? I mean, when I
well,
say...
because you're asking me to go naked. You know, I mean, I don't know whether you're somebody I want to go naked.
When I say to somebody, tell me about yourself, that they'll typically tell me about their job, how many kids they have.
Or the credentials. Yes, because that's facts.
Is that protectionism? Is that the way we keep ourselves from being vulnerable? Well, you know, what's interesting is people would say that, you know, in one-on-one conversation, it is much more difficult for me to tell my story. And people are often, how are you so honest in your books? This is nobody else in the room. That's how I'm honest with my books.
Exactly, that's the point. That's exactly.
can...
Every writer I ever knew, especially every memoirist or autobiographical, you know, will say the same thing, absolutely. And also, I think the telling of stories, or at least for me, maybe I'm now revealing more than I should, but the telling of the story, of your own story, allows you to understand some things that you would not have understood otherwise. You're almost telling it to yourself first before you tell it to other people. It's a way, and you make the point in one of the things you do, that there's so much stuff that happens in life, none of it is really memorable. I mean, it's all a blur, right? It's one fact, you got up, you went to work, it didn't matter. It's when you build a story around it, and it's almost the way you harvest your past, so to speak. You go through the orchard and pick up the things that matter.
The mind tends to look back on our history and only remember the elements of story.
That's right.
The things that happen that are either our ambitions, our conflicts, our resolutions, and the best definition I've ever heard for story is that it's a sense-making device.
It is a sense-making. It's an order-making, I really think. It's a way you make order. But I think the mind, with all due respect, the mind only remembers the thing that somehow the emotion or the heart has already flagged, so to speak, and then the mind goes back and picks it up and brings it out into conscious existence. There's an interesting interplay where story is concerned between mind and heart. Well, I guess where religion is concerned too. But there's a real, the heart has to dwell in the story or it's not worth coughing out, and the mind sort of deletes it.
What do you mean by that, the heart has to dwell in the story?
The emotion has to have occupied part of the event for it to be a story. The good stories, the stories that live, the stories that will ring true are the ones where the heart has already dwelled first and flagged it. And then the mind lives it out, which is part of why it's hard to give it away, because I can tell you a factual story, and even then I've revealed myself by the facts I chose, right, to tell and how I arranged them. So it is an order-making thing. But there are various levels that get farther and farther in. Isn't that true?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
And the nearer in you come, the more vulnerable you are, but the more beautiful usually the stories are, because that's when the emotion comes out and lets you see who really lives in there.
Why are we afraid to be that vulnerable? I mean, you know, when we're meeting people...
It's interesting because there's not really any political vulnerability in that usually, or
what do you mean by political vulnerability?
Well, I mean you're not going to be smashed or crashed or rejected for the story usually that you tell, unless you've done something heinous. I mean,
right.
I assume if you confess to murder, you're probably going to have consequences. But in the normal course of folks sitting at a church or something, telling stories, or at a club telling stories, you're not going to be ostracized or marked as peculiar or different in some way. So there's no political danger. The danger is we live inside ourselves, all of us, basically. Mm-hmm. And you're opening the front door and letting someone else come in. And once you let them in, I mean, we've all
can hurt you.
That's right. They can hurt you. And also, we've all had neighbors. I can't even remember moving once because we had a neighbor who would never go away. Who was just there whether the door was open or not. And sometimes when you tell stories, you let folk in and they forget to leave, and you've got a permanent house guest in your innards that you didn't mean to have.
That's a wonderful way of saying it. That's part of the risk.
It's part of the risk. It's part of the risk.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we probably don't tell our stories all that often. And yet, I think with the risk of telling our stories, we are able to be known, and
absolutely,
and that's by design, right? I mean, we were designed to not be alone and to be known by other people. So it's sort of a food for us, right?
It is indeed. It is indeed. And the metaphor of the self as a house, and it's very much for me very useful sort of metaphor.
Yeah.
And I do think you can meet people at the fence line with story, or you can meet them on the front porch, or you can bring them into the living room. But when you bring them into the kitchen, you better be married to them, or have bred them, or something like that. Because that's real intimacy. But yes, we're meant to live in relation.
You talk about the metaphor of a house, and you actually, in one of your memoirs, you describe in beautiful prose the home that you grew up in, and you talk about the upstairs being your part of the house, and the downstairs being your parents' part of the house, and your father having the study and your mother having the kitchen in the living room, and
you remember.
I mean, it's such a wonderful. The Shaping of a Life is the name of the book. Just to plug it, it's a beautiful, beautiful book.
Oh, thank you.
And you talk about the importance of place shaping your story, which is not something. I mean, if you study the elements of story, you know that exposition in Fair Verona, where we lay our scene, right?
Exactly.
There's always
Fair
a place
where we lay our scene.
But you really think it's a dominant character in the shaping of your life.
Principal character.
Oh, please explain that. The principal character in the shaping of a life is a place.
Is a place. That's right. Place is enormously important for me, and I don't think it's idiosyncratic. I think it's true for most people.